In the last section, we saw our first successful end-to-end test around creating a record. So we made a new instance of a user, which we named Joe. We saved Joe, and then we asserted that Joe was successfully saved to our database. Now that we know how to insert records to our database, we're going to work on how do we retrieve or query or find records out of our database. There's two distinct ways right now in which we might pull a record out of our database. First off, if we have a user saved to our database with the name of Joe and an ID of ASDF123 or whatever ID they might have, we could either try to find a user with a name of Joe, or we might find a user with a particular given ID. So these are both different kinds of read operations that we might take out of our database. The first one is kind of like a query of sorts, right? We might have many users with the name of Joe. And so we're saying find all of the possible users that we might have with the name of Joe. In the second case, we might find a particular user with this given ID where we would use this operation whenever we want to find a very particular user. So again, the first one is a little bit of a search type query. The second one is more like a lookup, like we're trying to find a very specific record. So let's add some tests to figure out how we might execute both these types of read operations with Mongoose and MongoDB. Inside of my project directory, I'm going to make a new file called reading test. We will come back and do a couple more tests with create, but for right now I want to kind of do the full spectrum of creating, reading, updating, and deleting records. So that's why we're going to skip on to reading for right now. The setup of this test file is going to look a lot like our create record as well, or a create test. So at the top we will require in the assert library and our user model, and then we'll put in a describe block to describe reading records out of our database. So first, let's start off with a little bit of boilerplate at the top. We'll say const assert, require assert, and user is require from source user. Remember the path here? We say go up one directory, go into the user folder, and then find the user file. So now we can specify our describe block. Let's say describe reading users out of the database. And inside of here, we can place as many it blocks as we would want. I think the first query, the first type of search that we'll do will be around finding all the different users that we have in our database with the name of Joe. So we'll start off with saying it finds all users with a name of Joe. And then we'll pass in a function as our second argument. So now inside of here, our ultimate goal is to figure out how do we query our database, how do we execute a query where we find all the users with the name of Joe. But of course, at this point in time, when we're inside of this it block right here, we don't actually have any records in our users collection whatsoever, because we've already got that test helper file where we repeatedly drop our collection of users. So before we can actually find any users with the name of Joe, we actually have to make sure that we have a user with the name of Joe inside the collection in the first place. So to do so, we are going to add in another before each statement inside of this describe block. So we'll add in a before each in here. And the purpose of this before each is to insert a record into our users collection with the name of Joe, just so that we can have some amount of test inside of this file, all concerned with finding the record that we just inserted. Okay, that's our goal here. So inside of our before each, we'll make a new user of Joe. And by the way, I'm going to very purposefully not put on a describe or a const or a let in front of this Joe right here. You'll see why in just a second. So we'll make a new user with the name of Joe. And then we'll say joe.save. And because it takes some amount of time for this save to complete right here, we will wait for that to be successfully completed with a then statement. And then after the record has been successfully saved, we'll call a done callback. So again, we'll reference done as it's passed to the before each. So save Joe, and then go ahead and continue with all the rest of the tests that we want to run. Now again, you'll notice that inside of here, I didn't put in const Joe or var Joe, anything like that. The reason I didn't do that is that we might want to make reference to Joe, like this very specific model, down inside of our tests inside of here. So if I declare a variable inside of this before each, it is not magically available to somewhere else inside this file or any other function. And this has nothing to do with Mocha, nothing to do with Mongoose, anything like that. This is just pure JavaScript. If I declare a variable inside this function, its scope is limited to this function. It is not magically available over here as well. To make sure that I can actually make a reference to Joe inside of all the other it blocks inside of this file, I'm going to declare Joe ahead of time with a let statement. So by defining the variable Joe outside of here, we will then execute it before each statement. Joe will be assigned to something, and then when our it block runs, Joe will be a record or an instance of a user. Okay, so that's the whole idea here. We'll declare our variables ahead of time, modify them inside the before each, and then we can reference them inside of our it block. And again, this is not something having to do with Mocha in particular. This is just vanilla JavaScript and how the language works. Okay, so I think that all of our setup is ready to go. Now we just need to add in a query inside this file to reach into our users collection and find all of our users with the name of Joe. So let's take care of that in the next section.